Just forgot to change the number. Okay. While we're waiting, am I already on the air? Am I already broadcasting?
Yes, Father. We've been broadcasting for 5 minutes. You could start now since we have about 88 participants.
Okay. Again, good afternoon to everyone. Sorry for that moment of consternation there, and shall we say, unwariness. Well, before we proceed with the class, let me just remind everyone of what we're doing here. No? Judging from the answers to the questions for the first two classes, I think I have to make a clarification on what the juridic structure means. You know? As I explained in the previous class, the juridic structure is like a matrix. It's our representation in the juridic world through laws, definitions, contracts, and all kinds of legal instruments of what is in reality. So it's something dynamic, it's something changing, it's not something static, so to speak, because people keep on making new contracts, redefining their situations. In the example that was cited, for example, a person may change his age, may change his domicile, etc., etc. What's important to realize is all that reality has its representation in the juridic world. Don't equate juridic with legal. Legal is just a part of the juridic world. What is legal is what is written down in norms or in laws or in specific forms. The juridic world is a bit bigger than that. No? But what's important to realize is it's I wouldn't say a make-believe matrix, because it's something precisely it's something very realistic. Unlike in the movie Matrix, where what's going on in the consciousness of all those people keyed to or hooked into the matrix is something make-believe, totally trumped up by the machine to keep you happy or to make you work, etc., etc. The juridic matrix should be something quote-unquote real. Otherwise, precisely that's what happens when you have an abuse of law, when you have legal fictions, things that do not really correspond to reality. Okay? That having been said, now we're going to apply all that notion to marriage. Marriage is a very real thing. It's that union, which is the expression of conjugal love between a man and a woman, who are committing and accepting themselves mutually in the totality of their personhood, which includes therefore their sexuality, being man or woman, that the man accepts the woman as man accepting a woman in her femininity and vice versa, which, if it is total, contains within itself the possibility of procreation, precisely because that's a natural, again, a natural instinct, a natural, shall we say, tendency that is crafted into human nature by the designer, which means to say God. Now, what the juridic structure of marriage means is all that series of provisions of the law that configure the existence or the non-existence of a real marriage. In other words, it's those sets of laws, of norms, of provisions that canon law or civil law, in its case, has come up with in order to protect and to guarantee the validity of any given marriage. That without such, shall we say, characteristics, without such qualities as defined by law, then in fact, what the law says, you're not bringing about a marriage. It may be a fiction of marriage. It may have the the appearance of a marriage, but without all of these things, then there won't be a marriage. Like, for example, okay, nowhere is this going to be very clear as in what we're going to take up in this class. So now that it's time, in the European continent, this is called the academic quarter, the Akademische Viertel in German, which is in the continent, all the classes are on the hour. You know, like, for example, this would have been a 2 o'clock class, but the professor comes in or starts the class at 2:15. That's called the academic quarter. It's like a palugit for all the students to come in late or whatever. Until that moment, you are not considered late. But after 2:15, then you're considered absent from the class already and things like that, okay? So as we did the last time, we begin this session with a short prayer. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. So again, good afternoon for all those who just came in and missed my first greeting. Good afternoon to everyone. I understand that now we have people coming all the way from Cagayan de Oro. Well, actually, last week we had people coming all the way from Davao. So this is a national coverage already. And now we are 99 participants actually registered. We had already reached 115. But okay, today's class is going to be on what we referred to before as the first pillar of the juridic structure of marriage. All that matrix that we mentioned, that structure, that mental structure, that juridic structure that we mentioned configures the existence or non-existence of marriage. All of it rests on 3 pillars. And the first one is the so-called matrimonial capacity, meaning to say, it's a set of provisions of the law that guarantees that the person who enters marriage, who celebrates the matrimonial contract, is in fact capable of doing so. And absent that capability, then what he does is an invalid marriage. Now, when we talk of matrimonial capacity, we are talking about canonical impediments to contract marriage. Legally constituted personal situations that render a person incapable of contracting a valid marriage. Is a juridic expression of a personal condition that constitutes an obstacle to the tria bona of marriage. Remember, we spoke of the tria bona, the 3 ends of marriage. Now, what the impediments, the incapacities describe are situations that will make the attainment of those 3 ends impossible. In the same way that we also said that the essential properties of marriage are essential because without them, the tria bona cannot be attained. Well, if we define that a little bit more, or rather, if we deconstruct that a little bit more, then we'll come up with the so-called impediments. The first impediment is the one of age. Canon 1083, paragraph 1 states that a man cannot validly enter marriage before the completion of his 16th year of age, nor a woman before the completion of her 14th year. That's the universal law. However, paragraph 2 of the same canon states that the Episcopal Conference of any given nation may establish a higher age for the lawful celebration of marriage. There's a logic to that because every country, every cultural environment may occasion or may result in the attainment of the required maturity for getting into marriage sooner or later. In the Philippines, for example, the CBCP has established 18 years for both men and women. And what's this 16 and 14? That happens, you know, in the more primitive societies. The more primitive a society is, it seems like the sooner they get into an age that is ready for marriage. Because in primitive societies, they get married very young. In Africa, for example, a 16-year-old man, or here it would be a boy, but there will be a man already. And definitely a 14-year-old woman who has passed the age of puberty, who is in her adolescence, is perfectly capable of bearing a child, also is capable of getting married. But the more sophisticated the society becomes, so the more cultural requirements there would be for maturity, for sophistication, etc., then the more years you need in order to reach that level of cultural sophistication to get into such a quote-unquote complicated and involved situation as the marital state. Okay? Now, think about this. Why should that be an impediment, or why should that affect capacity? Better said, how does that square with what we said earlier, that the impediments and the capacities have something to do with the inherent capability of a person to attain the tria bonera, the tria bona rather of marriage? Well, just think about this, no? That without the proper age, what are the tria bona again? Fidelity, what do you call this? The good of children, in other words, fertility, and for the baptized, the good of the sacrament. Now, fidelity, the mutual good of the spouses. Anyone not of the right age, immature, is not capable of fulfilling the other, of perfecting the other, of even being faithful to the other, for that matter, because he's still playing games, right? The same thing happens with the good of children. Somebody who's too young to effectively rear children, not just get pregnant or bring about a child, but to effectively rear a child is not going to accomplish that good of procreation and upbringing of children. And the same thing with the sacrament, because if marriage is going to be a real path towards holiness, a person who is not sufficiently mature to make use of that path in order to become a saint is not going to do it. And for him, rather than being a path to holiness, that complication of getting married is just going to make him worse, etc. Right? Okay, next is impotence. Let me just put this, show small active speaker. Okay. Canon 1084 says, paragraph 1, that antecedent and perpetual impotence to have sexual intercourse, whether on the part of the man or on the part of the woman, whether absolute or relative, by its very nature, invalidates marriage. Now, let's dissect this thing. First, antecedent and perpetual. So it must be an impotence which is antecedent to the celebration of marriage, because if it's consequent, sooner or later, people become impotent when they get old, right? So that doesn't count. It must be, the impotence must have been there before the celebration of marriage. Why is this again? Because we're looking at the things that invalidate or validate the coming about of marriage. Anything that happens afterwards does not affect the coming about of the celebration of marriage. We're looking at the validity of that moment of making that contract. So all the factors that we look into to see the validity of that contract or of that institution that's arising at that very moment must be present there or before, not after, because the things that happen after are irrelevant to the matter being considered, almost irrelevant, because some are relevant. Now, the other thing is perpetual, because again, a temporary impotence can happen in the course of a life, but what is important here is that it's a permanent condition that therefore makes that person incapable of getting into marriage. And then further, impotence for what? For sexual intercourse. Not impotence to dance the Zumba or impotence to cook a decent paella to do laundry. All of those things are okay. They may be useful for the marriage, but they're not essential. No, but sexual intercourse, the sexual union between man and woman, that's, shall we say, not critical, but that is essential to conjugal love. But then, in the process of jurisprudence, the notion of impotence or potency, for that matter, which is its opposite, has been refined to these two components here. First is the capacity for a sustained erection, sustained enough for penetration. Because if it cannot be sustained, and if there's no penetration, that's impotence. And not only that, of ejaculating in the proper place, in this particular case, within the vagina. So failure in this, or the absence of this, or defect in this, is impotence. Paragraph 2, if the impediment of impotence is doubtful, whether the doubt be one of law or one of fact, the marriage is not to be prevented, nor, while the doubt persists, is it to be declared null. So in other words, for it to be a cause of nullity, there must be no doubt that it's really there. Paragraph 3, without prejudice to the provisions of Canon 1098, which is the canon that speaks about fraud, we will take that up later, is sterility neither forbids nor invalidates a marriage. Remember, impotence is the incapacity to carry out the sexual act. Infertility is, there may be a capacity to carry out the sexual act, but the incapacity for procreation, for reproduction, that is not invalidating. Only impotence is. Unless, that's why there's this fatal thing there, Canon 1098, unless the fact of infertility was fraudulently withheld. In other words, what invalidates it is not so much the fact of infertility, but rather the fact that you withheld that information to the other part who may consider fertility as essential to getting married. Because on the other hand, if it was told that you're infertile and the other party agreed to it, well, I don't care. And so if that means we're not going to have children, but we'll have each other, then that would be a valid marriage. Because what invalidates is not the incapacity to have children, but rather the incapacity to carry out the sexual act, which is called impotence. Next, disparity of cult. So it says there, a marriage is invalid when one of the two persons was baptized in the Catholic Church or received into it, and the other was not. In other words, marriage between a baptized and an unbaptized is invalid. That's what you call disparity of cult. Now, there's a reason for this. Because paragraph 2 says that this impediment is not to be dispensed unless the conditions mentioned in Canons 1125 and 1126 have been fulfilled. We'll go to those conditions shortly. But sometimes, when there are things like that, impediments that can be dispensed, there's a mentality prevailing out there that, yung pala naman so if it can be dispensed, so ask for a dispensation. Well, we cannot think that way. What we should think rather is, if there's an impediment, if there's a prohibition, there must be a reason for it. And the reason for this is very simple. Two things. Number one, to safeguard the faith, the Catholic faith of the Catholic party, of the baptized party in this particular case. And number two, to safeguard the Christianity of the offspring that will ensue. And that's the reason why those canons 1125 and 1126, what they prescribe is that if the dispensation is that the dispensation will not be given unless those conditions are fulfilled. And what are the conditions? Number one, that it's not a danger to the faith of the Catholic or the baptized party. And number two, that the children that will arise are going to be raised as Catholics. Now, if at the time the marriage was contracted, one party was commonly understood to be baptized, or if his or her baptism was doubtful, the validity of the marriage is to be presumed in accordance with Canon 1060, unless it is established with certainty that one party was baptized and the other was not. In other words, this is the so-called favor matrimony, the favor of law, the presumption of law that is granted to a duly celebrated marriage. It's a principle of law, no? Of the whole juridical system, that whatever takes place juridically, following the formalities of law, is considered valid until it's proven otherwise. So in this particular case, that's what it says, no? That if the baptism of one of the parties is doubtful, but the fact is they got married. If they got married, you normally don't get married unless you provided documentation that you were baptized. Okay? So in other words, it's not as if it's not known that you were baptized. You won't be allowed to get married in church if you don't prove your baptism. But if something arises afterwards that puts in doubt the validity of that document or the validity of your baptism, then that doubt will not be taken as an automatic declaration of the invalidity of the marriage until it's verified. The presumption is if it took place before witnesses and after due investigation by the parish priest that all the conditions are there, the requirements are there, then the presumption is it's valid until it's proven otherwise. Okay? So that's the disparity of cults. Then you have a set of 3 impediments which have to do with an existing bond. And the first one is the bond of marriage. Then 85 paragraph 1 says that a person bound by the bond of a previous marriage, an existing marriage in other words, even if it were not consummated, invalidly attempts marriage. In other words, if a person who's still married, even if it were not consummated for some reason, if he tries to get married, even if he succeeds in doing so, meaning to say he was able to fool the parish priest, to fool everybody, and they got married, well, that marriage is invalid. Of course, if nobody knew that of the previous marriage, everybody will think it's valid, right? Until it's proven otherwise. If proof were unearthed that such a marriage existed in the past and it's still there, it hasn't been annulled or it hasn't been declared null, then that second marriage will be null, will be invalid. Paragraph 2, even though the previous marriage is invalid or for any reason dissolved, it is not thereby lawful to contract another marriage before the nullity or the dissolution of the previous one has been established lawfully and with certainty. Now, this is important because, you know, there are many people who may have gotten married in an irresponsible youth when they were 20. What I mentioned in the last class, the reason why we're having these courses, the interest for prejudicial marriage counselors. It's not so much to help people break up a present union, but rather precisely to help them regularize a present union, an actual union which is working, but which is irregular because they're not married in church. They're only married civilly. And they're not married in church because there's a previous marriage, precisely when somebody was young and irresponsible, that had broken down and had been forgotten, but it's there. So now when you try to get married, you can't because you have to prove your freedom to get married. And in order to prove that, you have to look at the records, and the records will show that there's an existing marriage. Now let's twist that around. The fact that you know that you had a previous marriage which broke apart, no, is no reason why you can get married, because that marriage, as the presumption of validity of marriage is stated earlier, the favor matrimony, says that marriage, even if it broke apart, is presumed valid until a competent court declares that it was invalid and declares it null and void ab initio from the very beginning. And there's the reason again for tribunals trying matrimonial cases. By the way, sidebar, as they would say. No? The ecclesiastical tribunals are not matrimonial tribunals. They are tribunals, period. They can try any case in canon law, invalidity of ordination, contests of ownership of convents and property, things like that, or whatever other thing that falls in the purview of canon law. It's just that the way things are, the more common cases that they try are marriage nullities. No? But there could be other things. There could be penal cases, for example, all this business of sexual abuse, all this business of, I don't know what, abuse of the sacraments. All of this can be tried in a ecclesiastical tribunal. So don't call them marriage tribunal. They are ecclesiastical or church tribunals. No? Okay, going forward. So a valid marriage, even unconsummated, there's a presumption of validity for it, the so-called favor matrimoni. And therefore, a declaration of nullity is needed before a posterior marriage can be celebrated. The next bond is the bond of holy orders. Canon 1087 says that those who are in sacred orders invalidly attempt marriage. This covers deacons, priests, and bishops. Should any one of those attempt to get married, even if they somehow fool people and they go through it, well, that marriage will be invalid from the very start. And then finally is the bond of religion, of the three bonds. Those who are bound by a public perpetual vow of chastity in a religious institute invalidly attempt marriage. Again, what are the three determinants there? It must be a public vow, not just a private vow. Why? Because a private vow, nobody can prove it, that there was such a vow. Only a public vow is juridically verifiable. Perpetual, again, because a non-perpetual vow lapses. All that person should do is wait for 1 year and it will lapse. And in a religious institute, if somebody made a vow on his own or in an association that happens to foster celibacy, that won't count. It must be a vow of perpetual chastity in an institute of consecrated life, a religious, in other words. That's why in that famous film, Sound of Music, and there you have there Julie Andrews with Christopher Plummer dancing in the garden. I think that's the song behind that is "Somewhere in My Youth or Childhood, I Must Have Done Something Good." Nothing comes from nothing, etc., etc. Well, Julie Andrews was not doing anything wrong because she was not a nun. She was a postulant yet, still rather. And then we have here a funny ground, which is called abduction. Canon 1089 says that no marriage can exist between a man and a woman who has been abducted or at least detained with a view to contracting a marriage with her, unless the woman, after she has been separated from her abductor and established in a safe and free place, chooses marriage of her own accord. Now, try to understand this. What the law does is to create an incapacity for such a situation. What situation? A woman that has been abducted. If a woman is in a state of kidnap, even were she to want to get married, because it can happen. A woman is kidnapped, and because it takes long, she falls in love with her captors. Remember Patricia Hearst of Eastman and Kodak, the heiress, the Stockholm Syndrome. You have to be old enough to remember this celebrated case. She was abducted and from terrorists from Stockholm, and she ended up falling in love with one of her captors and joining the band. And later on, precisely, she was rediscovered because they were caught in a bank heist. Stuff for movies, right? Well, anyway, so even with the Stockholm Syndrome, the law itself makes that woman incapacitated for getting married unless she were freed from abduction, and in that state of freedom states that she wants to get married. Now, this phenomenon only, as you can see it, the law only covers women. Men are not covered by this because in principle, men don't get kidnapped, no? And then somebody will immediately say, that, oh, what if somebody is napikot, somebody is being forced in a shotgun marriage? Well, that will enter later on in the matter of consent, the freedom of consent, which is a different pillar of the juridic structure. But here what's interesting is that how the law protects the so-called weaker sex by creating a fiction of law, a structure of law describing that a woman in a state of abduction is automatically incapable of getting married, even if she wanted to. 8, crime. Canon 1090, paragraph 1. One who, with a view to entering marriage with a particular person, has killed that person's spouse or his or her own spouse, invalidly attempts this marriage. So in this paragraph 1, it's unilateral. Only one of the contractants, the contracting parties, is guilty of anything, either killing his or her own spouse or causing the death of the spouse of the other. Now, if that is true, it's also true if there's conspiracy. That's paragraph 2. They also invalidly attempt marriage with each other who by mutual physical or moral action brought about the death of either spouse. A conspiracy, in other words. No? That's what you call crime. No? Again, these are bizarre things that you might think they happen only in movies, but okay, they can happen. The mere fact that the law has configured them into juridic structures, so to form part of the juridic structure, means that they had happened often enough, at least in the past. Now here's an interesting thing, consanguinity. Marriage is invalid between those related by consanguinity in all degrees of the direct line, whether ascending or descending, legitimate or natural. Now here we have the law configuring an incapacity that comes about by blood relation. In other words, what the law is saying is that people who are related by blood to a certain degree cannot contract marriage validly. It's not that they can, right? They can get married, but the law says that marriage is going to be invalid. So it's important to realize the background of this provision, of this norm of law. Where is it coming from? It's coming from the attempt, the pretension it's called. Pretension is an aim, a goal. It's the pretension of law to protect the sanctity of the domestic community. In times past, it was very common for the extended family to live in the same house, in the same manor, the same mansion, or at least the same compound. Now, what the law has done is to make it impossible for a valid union or a valid marriage to arise between certain people who are living in such a situation, so that people who are living in such a situation, what situation again? A family, domestic, informal situation where, in Tagalog, we would say, hindi dapat katalo, no? That people should not be looking at each other with romantic eyes or much less with lust or as sexual partners, that they're members of the same family, right? Now, in the past, with the extended family system, this would take in more people, more relatives. But in the present scenario where there's so much mobility and members of the same family may not even know each other anymore, then this holds less. And that's the reason why here we have the definition of what constitutes a relationship of consanguinity. either in the direct line or the collateral line. Let's try to understand this. Look at that picture there. Oops, I don't think you can see my pointer anyway, but starting from the top, that's GGF, that's great grandfather. And then going to the left of that, you have the grandfather, and then the mother, and then you. You are in black. No? The kind of consanguinity that you have with the GGF, your great grandfather, is what you call direct line. That you can trace a line by what do you call this? By generation, starting from your great grandfather to you. No? Great grandfather, his son is your grandfather, and his daughter is your mother, and you are your mother's either son or daughter. Okay? Now, that's the direct line. How about the collateral line? Collateral consanguinity is that which arises between two people who can trace back and come to a common root. For example, starting from your great-grandfather again, going to you. Between you and one of the children of your great-grandfather, let's say GAU, your grand-aunt, you see? Grand-aunt is the sister of your grandfather, right? Now, between you and your great-grand-aunt, there is a relationship of consanguinity in the collateral line. The same thing happens with your uncle, and the same things with the cousin, your cousin, who is the child of your uncle, which is different from that other cousin that you have there, the one in violet, which is again the child of another one of your aunt. Now let's try to get at the numbers here. Between you and your great-grand-aunt, right? Your grand-aunt, rather, not great-grand-aunt, but grand-aunt, the one in Vermilion there. Is that a direct line? No, because you're not directly descended from her. That's a collateral line. Now, how do you count the relationship? You count it by counting the number of generations starting from you all the way to her. So you have you, your mom, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and finally your grand-aunt. How many generations is that starting from you? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then minus the root, your great-grandfather. So therefore that's 4th. So between you and your grand-aunt, you're related in the collateral line to the 4th degree. So 4th degree in the collateral line. How about your uncle? Your uncle who is the son of your grand-aunt. That's 5th degree. How about your other aunt who is the daughter of your grandfather? Who is therefore the sister of your mom. And you count. You, 1, 2, 3, 4, minus your grandfather, so 3. Between you and your aunt, who is a sibling of your mom, the same thing would happen if he's a sibling of your dad. Instead of M, mom there, you put F, your father, the same things will happen, right? So that will be 3rd degree in the collateral line. So what is the law? So in the direct line, all degrees, descending or ascending, is invalid. You can get married to your mom, to your grandmother, or to your great-grandfather. And the same thing with your children, etc. You can get married with them. Now, in the collateral line, however, it is invalid up to the 4th degree. 4th degree. So if you look at the chart, what is a 4th degree in the collateral line? If U is, or U there, the black U. 4th degree. That will be your cousin Violet, which means in normal parlance, you call that your first cousin. No? Is the child of your aunt who is a sibling of one of your parents. So you count. No? You, your mom, your grandfather, your aunt, your cousin. You say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but minus your grandfather, who's the common root, that's fourth. That's fourth degree in the collateral line. Okay? Now, how about you and your second cousin there? No, how do you count that? No, you, your mom, your grandfather, your great grandfather, your grand aunt, your uncle, and your cousin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minus the root, and that would be 6th degree in the collateral line. So what does the law say? That it's invalid all the way to the 4th degree. So all the way to first cousin. All the way to first cousin. And I'm sorry, somebody was knocking at the door. So that's invalid. However, jurisprudence, common practice has shown, or dictates rather, or allows dispensation all the way to the 3rd degree of the collateral line, meaning to say between you and your aunt or you and your uncle, that can be dispensed, but never in the 2nd degree of the collateral line, because that's siblings. Because according to jurisprudence, that belongs to natural law. That by natural law, the law of nature, the law of the way human nature is, that is discounted. Because really, and several grounds, as a matter of fact, not just anymore the protection of the sanctity of the domestic front of the family, the intimacy of the family, but also there's some genetic things there that are unhealthy for such inbreeding. For those of you who are doctors, you know very well that there are some recessive genes which are negative, meaning to say, the only thing is you don't normally see them. Hemophilia, for example, is recessive until you have sufficient inbreeding that recessive genes come out, and that's unhealthy. Okay. So, paragraph 4. A marriage is never to be permitted if a doubt exists as to whether the parties are treated by, or rather related by consanguinity in any degree of the direct line or in the 2nd degree of the collateral line. Next. Legal affinity. What is legal affinity? Is the in-laws. Is the relationship that arises between you and the blood relatives of your spouse. So again, let's understand this. In order for legal affinity to exist, you must be married legally or validly, right? Because the relationship of legal affinity of in-law exists between you and the relatives, blood relatives of your valid spouse. Okay? Now, what does it say? There is no proper measurement of legal affinity. So the basis of the reckoning is the relationship of consanguinity of your spouse with that person. So what you measure is the degree of consanguinity of your spouse with that person, and that's your degree of legal affinity with that person. For example, the sister of your wife. What's the degree of affinity? The sister of your wife? That's 2nd degree in the collateral line, right? So your relationship with your sister-in-law is 2nd degree in the collateral line. How about if your wife had a child previously? Let's say a daughter, the daughter of your wife. How are you related to her? That's 1st degree in the direct line. Okay, now what does the law says? Affinity in any degree of the direct line invalidates marriage. Any degree of the direct line. So whether it be parents of your spouse or offsprings of your spouse, not your offsprings, an offspring beforehand, before you married that spouse, that constitutes an impediment. But nothing about the collateral line, right? So therefore, the sister of your wife, can you marry the sister of your wife? Provided, of course, your wife dies first, right? Because if not, then there will be that problem with the bond. But what if your wife dies? Can you marry her sister, your sister-in-law? Is there any legal impediment, canonical impediment? And you can see that there's none. As a matter of fact, it's one of the best arrangements, apparently. I know someone who precisely before she died of cancer, asked her husband, if you know what's good for you, you marry my sister because she's very good. And that's what he did afterwards, okay? Okay. Next is the impediment of public propriety, is the relationship between a person and the blood relations of a common law partner. In other words, the relationship between a person and the relatives of somebody who's not his or her lawful spouse, but just a live-in partner. It's similar to legal affinity in laws, but for unmarried couples. That's why I call it outlaws. Okay, so Canon 1093. The impediment of public propriety arises when a couple live together after an invalid marriage or from a notorious or public concubinage. It invalidates marriage in the first degree of the direct line between the man and those related by consanguinity to the woman and vice versa. Whereas for legal affinity, it bars union or marriage with all degrees of the direct line. For this case of just a common law or there's no real marriage between a person and the other person, it only bars up to the first degree. So in other words, you can get married to the daughter of your kabit or to her mom. That's crazy, but okay, that cannot be done. Okay. Next, legal adoption. Those who are legally related by reason of adoption cannot validly marry each other if their relationship is in the direct line or in the second degree of the collateral line. So in other words, adopted children cannot get married to their adoptive parents. Also, and not just adoptive children, but the children of adoptive children, because it doesn't say any limit there, no? Direct line, all degrees. But in the collateral line, only the second degree, meaning to say you can't get married to your adopted sister or adopted brother. But anything more than that, you can get married. Remember that your adopted sibling, adopted sister, adopted brother, might have children. Can you marry them? Yes. Or they may have parents before they were adopted. Can you marry their parents? Yes. No? Again, as I say, it's a little odd, but it can be done as far as the law is concerned. Okay? Now, one last thing. So far, all those 12 are what we call impediments. They're clearly defined in the Code of Canon Law. But then there's something else which is not included in the impediments, but which, on the other hand, if you read it well, constitutes an incapacity and should therefore be grouped with these factors that incapacitate a person for getting married validly. And that is the famous Canon 1095. It's easy enough to memorize. Canon 1095, which has 3 numbers, 1, 2, and 3. Because Canon 1095 says, characterizes a series of conditions that makes a person, renders a person rather incapable of entering marriage. The first one is lack of use of reason. The second one is lack of due determination or discretion. And the third one is the so-called psychological incapacity, the incapacity to assume the essential obligations of marriage for reasons of a psychic nature. We're going to go into that more in the next class or the next classes, but suffice it to say at this point that what Canon 1095 effectively lays down is that there's a series of conditions juridically defined that renders a person incapable of getting married. That's important because here we're dealing really with incapacities, the incapacity to enter marriage, which therefore affects the person, not just a specific act, not just the act of consenting, because consent, remember, is the second leg, the second pillar, the structure of marriage, but rather affects the person himself or herself, just like age or being kidnapped or consanguinity. Those things accrue to the person. Now, 1095 describes a series of qualities that accrue to the person as a person, that accompanies him or her in a more or less stable manner, and it makes her, according to law, incapable of entering marriage. We'll get more into that later in the next classes. So for now, let's take a short break for those who want to take a break. And for those who want to ask questions, I can entertain questions for the next 5 or 10 minutes.
There are several questions in the chat box, Father. Okay. Would you like to ask? Yes.
Help me.
Okay. One is somebody's asking, does the juridic fall within the natural law?
In canon law, yes. Because it's canon law. But it's the law not all the time. Because you see, it will only fall within the natural law if the ones crafting the law are sensitive to the natural law. As a matter of fact, if you really look at the nature of law, any law, man-made law, will only be law if it respects the natural law. And anything that doesn't respect natural law is an abuse of law. Because anyone can come up with a law, anyone can come up with a contract, anyone can describe a juridic situation. But if it violates the natural law, then what is its reason for being? Better still, what will be its title to being imposed or to being obeyed? So if it's not human nature in itself, if it's not the way things are in themselves, then it will only be imposed by force. That's the reason why unnatural laws, the abuses of law, are always imposed only by a dictator or by violence. While a law which is based on nature, which is in consonant with natural law, almost has its own force of imposition. The only reason why they're violated will be because of human perfidy, meaning to say, okay, we're not in our right frame all the time because of fallen nature, because of original sin. But the majority of people would rather obey or rather attend to or observe a real law.
Next question, Father. Somebody's asking, how do you count the completion of the 16th year for determination of the age of marriage, Father?
Yes, up to the day itself. So it's completed. No, those ages, yes, I can see the law is completed.
Yes, and what in determining the correct age, what rule should be considered? The rule of the country of origin of the one who wishes to get married, or the age of validity being followed by the country where the marriage is to be celebrated?
Well, I don't see the difficulty because age is age.
Mm-hmm.
And canon law defines age as completed. So that's what has to be obeyed is canon law, not civil law.
Yeah, it's a different. I think it's a different thing altogether in civil law. But anyway, um, there's a question: what if both were baptized as Catholic, but one of them became born again or INC? Will the Catholic baptism still be considered valid?
Okay. Baptism, the condition of being baptized, the condition of having been saved by Christ, the condition is something stable. Once baptized, always baptized, unless one formally renounces his baptism
Mm-hmm.
with the formal act, meaning to say an exterior act witnessed uh, willfully renouncing. Now, most people who become born again, especially who just become born again, or even so, just becomes Protestant, do not renounce their Catholicity. No? It's only people who become perhaps they become Iglesia INC or they become Muslim that they may be asked to renounce their previous faith. But normally there's no renunciation like that. No? So they are still baptized.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, this one is a follow up question to the one he posted in the classroom. It's about the link of the list of valid and invalid baptisms dated 2014 that I
Mhm.
posted in the Google Classroom included baptisms administered by Baptists as considered valid by the Roman Catholic Church. Is there a
Mhm.
newer or more updated list than that?
Well, okay. That's a recurring question. So, if I were to be pushed, and I would say we have to attend to the current list. No, maybe I made a mistake that the baptism by Baptists are valid. If that were so, then let it be. It's like that. No.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Father, if one of the spouses at the time of the celebration of the marriage was undergoing cancer treatment, it is possible that that person may not have intended to have children because of the fear of having a child with disability, etc. Will that invalidate the marriage?
Uh, no, why not? Why should it? No.
Mm.
If there's a reason for not wanting a child, a valid reason, because in principle, conjugal love, we said before, diba? Conjugal love is open to life.
Mhm.
It's part of conjugal life, fertility, fecundity, rather. The openness to life is part of conjugal love. But openness uh, means an attitude of welcoming a child in general, unless there's a reason otherwise. Now, if there's a health reason that makes it unhealthy to have a child, which, by the way, since that is something very important, it's not something that should be taken lightly, no? Not just because one gynecologist or one doctor says it's dangerous, then it's taken seriously. Not quite, no? You have to get a second opinion and third opinion because many times positions like that are born out of not really medical reasons, but more of an attitude against children that reflects the bias of the gynecologist or of the doctor. Uh, I've come across so many cases of married couples or of women who have been told by their gynecologists that you cannot have another child. It's very dangerous for you because this is already your fifth cesarean section. And I have known ladies who have had 8 cesarean sections and have done so without any problem whatsoever. So, in other words, it's not a hard and fast rule. But if there's really a medical condition that makes having a child dangerous, then okay, so be it. It's not that she's close to it. They're open to it, but physiologically, they cannot. In the same way that hey, I'm open to having a steak lunch tomorrow, but this condition of the pandemic makes it impossible for me to do so. That's the kind of openness.
If a baptized Catholic who later becomes an atheist and was in that state when he got married and gets married in Catholic rites, does it can that person contract a valid marriage?
Okay, that will enter into another class, no? Because it will enter the quality of the consent. Because remember, what are again the tria bona of marriage? The tria bona of marriage is the good of fidelity of the spouses to each other, the good of children that can ensue, and then third, very important, the good of the sacrament. Now, an atheist is not thinking of sacrament. So as a matter of fact, that's one of the more common causes of nullity nowadays, because of the degree of ignorance, the degree of lack of formation of people, that there are many people who are getting married and then are thinking of the sacraments. So if people get married without sacramental consciousness, that could be a ground of nullity afterwards. They just went through the procedure in the same way that they could have done it in City Hall. It's just that, just like many of those Japanese tourists who come here for marriage, because marriage in church is a very romantic thing. It's very nice, much better than going to City Hall and getting married before a judge. Now, some people get married that way without respect for the sacrament. That's invalid. But of course, we cannot say that a priori. That must be proven in court. But if it's proven in court that somebody got married without any mind at all for the sacrament, because precisely he's an atheist, that can be rendered null, declared null. Interesting, right?
Yeah. Somebody's asking, please define impotence on the part of the woman.